January 25, 1945. On Adolf Hitler's orders, Küstrin was turned into a fortress town, which meant it had to be defended to the last man and the last bullet. The penalty for retreating would be death. It was here, just 70 kilometers from the German capital, that the prelude to the Battle of Berlin would take place. But before we begin the analysis of this forgotten battle, let's briefly put it into context. Since December 1944, Hitler has been repeatedly warned of an impending Soviet offensive on the Vistula front. His response had been to simply ignore them. Finally, the house of cards that represented the German defense on the Vistula, in Guderian's words, collapsed on January 12th when the Russians launched Operation Vistula-Oder. With up to 6 large army groups, including Zkukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front, the Red Army swept through the German defenses and began advancing at full speed toward the Oder River near Berlin. One of the desperate measures taken by the German leader was the appointment of Himmler as supreme commander of the newly created army group Vistula on January 28th. As everything was falling apart in German-occupied Poland, just a few miles away in Küstrin, people were going about their daily routine. The war had claimed most of the men of military age, and those on the streets were mostly children, women, and the elderly. On the radio, German propaganda touted the invincible Eastern Wall, and if anyone doubted that claim, they kept it to themselves. Thus, while the defeats suffered by the German army in Poland were being ignored on the radio and in the news, the first refugees began to arrive in Küstrin. At first, it was just a trickle, but soon it became an avalanche. The first came from the west, fleeing the devastating Allied air raids on major German cities. For most of them, Küstrin was just a stopover on their way to other destinations. Things began to change when the flow reversed and refugees began arriving from the east. The first wave consisted of senior members of the National Socialist Party and their families. They were followed by civilians who used whatever means of transport they could get and brought back disturbing stories of Russian advances and Wehrmacht retreats. Slowly, people began to get nervous, and that feeling grew when the local Volkssturm battalion, composed mainly of teenagers and men who were unfit or too old for military service, was mobilized on January 24th. There was no longer any doubt that something devastating was happening just a few kilometers away from them in an easterly direction. On January 25th, the Führer order declared Küstrin a fortress, with General Adolf Regener as its commander. However, the title Küstrin Fortress was almost ridiculous. The town was home to engineering and artillery units, as well as a few infantry units made up of conscripts or soldiers convalescing from their wounds. The defensive positions were insignificant, as most had been neglected or destroyed in the previous years, and the frozen ground made digging trenches or ditches difficult. Furthermore, it was reported that the Soviets were only about 70 kilometers away and would arrive at any moment. During the last days of January, the garrison of Küstrin Fortress began to grow as a variety of small units began to arrive in the town. The fortress's anti-tank weapons were reinforced by the arrival of a few Panther tank turrets. The turrets, equipped with 75 mm guns, were embedded in strong points along possible avenues of attack. As more units arrived, the defending force became better organized. There were some Luftwaffe members from anti-aircraft units. There was also a battalion made up mainly of Turkmens, as well as another made up mainly of troops from the Caucasus. There were Hitler Youth, the Volkssturm, some Hungarians, and even several members of the Waffen-SS. Some men were individuals who had been separated from their units and had been rounded up by the military police and forced to serve in the garrison. It seemed that this mix of units would be able to do little against the Russians, but General Regener and later SS General Heinz Rheinefarth worked hard to turn them into a real fighting force. While the Germans tried to reinforce their meager defenses, the Soviets continued to advance westward. After taking Warsaw, Zhukov's armies had advanced another 130 kilometers in the period from January 20th to 22. By the 25th, Colonel General Vasily Zkukov's 8th Guards Army, following in the footsteps of the 1st Guards Tank Army, had surrounded the 60,000-man Poznan fortress. Leaving parts of both armies to besiege the city, Zkukov ordered both commanders to continue advancing westward. Zkukov wanted to reach the Oder quickly and establish bridgeheads on the west bank. Rear units would then eliminate German strong points, such as Poznan, and then deploy to consolidate positions on the west bank and prepare for the final advance on Berlin. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Around noon on January 25th, I received a phone call from Stalin. I briefed him on the situation and he asked me about our next moves. I told him that since the enemy was demoralized and could not put up serious resistance, we would continue to advance towards the Oder and try to seize a bridgehead at Küstrin. However, Stalin was worried about Zhukov's right flank. Meanwhile, work continued at Küstrin to strengthen the defenses. The available materials were limited, but as more and more refugees from the east continued to arrive in the town, work intensified as the Russians were known to be getting closer. A major storm that swept through Central Europe on 27 and the 28th of January managed to delay Zhukov's advance somewhat and gave the German defenders an extra day or two. In the last days of January, the weather became warmer and the snow that had fallen during the blizzard began to melt, turning the previously frozen ground into a sticky mass of mud. Zhukov's forces slowed down again, but on the 31st, the forward elements of his front reached the Oder north of Küstrin. The flow of refugees into Küstrin suddenly stopped on the 31st. It was an ominous warning for the garrison. In the early afternoon, a column of Soviet tanks rolled through the village of Druids, just north of Küstrin. They ran over a group of panzer grenadiers assigned to a defensive position, and then scattered in search of other targets. A group of a dozen tanks, many of them American Shermans, forced their way through the outskirts of Küstrin and into Neustadt. They continued to advance toward the Warthe bridges, but were stopped by a rush of panicked civilians whose vehicles had created a traffic jam at a major intersection. Finding the road blocked, the Russian armor turned around and looked for another route of access to the river. The German garrison had been completely surprised by the initial penetration, but when the Soviets reached the heart of Neustadt, the alarm was finally raised and tank destroyer teams began to hunt down the Russian armor. Surprisingly, only a few infantrymen accompanied the tanks, and the German forces soon began to eliminate the Soviet attackers with Panzerfausts or sticky bombs. In the end, almost all of the Soviet tanks in the lead were destroyed. Zhukov had reached the Oder, but the Soviet marshal had to face several obstacles. His first task was to establish his bridgeheads on the western bank of the river. Little by little, he was able to establish positions at Kienitz, about 20 kilometers north of Küstrin and south of the city at Göritz. Zhukov had to deal with a shortage of supplies because his fleeting advance had taken him away from his supply depots. In addition, he began to receive reports of a large concentration of German troops on his right flank, which gradually caught his attention. During the march to the Oder, the First Belarusian Front is estimated to have lost 17,000 men and had another 60,300 wounded or sick, representing a loss of 7% of its total personnel. Zhukov thus knew that for the final assault on Berlin, his forces would have to be at full strength. Stalin and the Soviet High Command came to the same conclusion. On February 2nd, Moscow officially declared the Vistula-Oder Offensive over. Zhukov was now free to consolidate his positions, but he still had two thorns in his side: the German bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Oder at Kunersdorf near Frankfurt, and the bridgehead at the Küstrin fortress. The appearance of the Soviet vanguard in the center of Küstrin led to an even greater intensification of the fortification of the city, with workdays of up to 18 hours a day. On the western bank of the Oder, opposite the city, elements of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division were established. The 25th Division had been shattered in the Soviet summer offensive and had been rebuilt in October. It was joined by the newly formed and understrength 303rd and 309th Infantry Divisions and the personnel of the still forming Kurmark Division. While some civilians began their exodus from Küstrin westwards towards Berlin, other troops crossed into the city. One of the German officers in Küstrin commented, "It was unpleasant to see the 12 and 13-year-olds who were part of the city's defense. We no longer had any men to fight with and were now using children. Surely the war could not continue much longer." Although the surprise attack by Soviet armored vehicles on the city had failed, the Russians continued to probe the German defenses. By the morning of February 1st, a Soviet unit had succeeded in taking a factory on the northwest edge of the city, annihilating a combined Hungarian Volkssturm force occupying it. Regener was replaced that same day by SS Major General Heinz Rheinefarth, despite the objections of the army. Rheinefarth's appointment was political, as he had virtually no experience commanding troops in combat. However, Himmler, serving as commander of Army Group Vistula, wanted one of his own to defend the city, and Rheinefarth was his choice over an army officer with combat experience. In his memoirs, Guderian commented that Rheinefarth was a good policeman, but not a good general. Although the Soviet forces directly involved in the fighting in the Küstrin sector were still relatively weak, Zkukov ordered Zkukov to maintain as much pressure as possible on the garrison. Zkukov thus ordered an attack on the southern sector of the city, which was repulsed with the loss of several tanks. Encouraged by this success, Rheinefarth ordered an attack of his own to recapture the Warnik area just east of Küstrin. The attack failed miserably in the face of intense Soviet fire, costing the German general many casualties. On February 3rd, a Russian attack managed to scratch a few yards outside Küstrin, but the Germans managed to hold their ground. The thaw that followed the January blizzard continued to wreak havoc on troop movements. Nevertheless, days later, Zkukov managed to close the supply route on the west bank of the Oder, isolating the Küstrin area. The success was short-lived, as the timely arrival of Colonel Zolenkov's 21st Panzer Division managed to open a narrow corridor that once again provided Küstrin with an escape route to the west. By the end of the first week of February, both sides had settled into a routine. The Soviets fired artillery into the town around noon and constantly mounted nuisance attacks, while the garrison worked to reinforce its defenses between artillery bombardments. General Zkukov gave the following analysis of the situation. The Küstrin citadel was located on an island formed by the Oder and Warthe rivers. During the spring, floods submerged all access to the island, leaving the only links to the citadel in dikes and roads connecting to Berlin, Frankfurt, Posen, and Stettin. The enemy defenders fortified these roads with various defensive structures, such as dugouts, pillboxes, trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. Thus, we could not deploy large forces on these narrow dikes, as passage was limited even for a single armored vehicle. There were approximately 6,800 civilians inside Küstrin, along with some 9,100 Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS personnel and 900 Volkssturm men defending the fortress. There were also an estimated 102 artillery pieces, 30 anti-aircraft guns, 50 mortars, 25 self-propelled guns, and 10 captured Katyusha rocket launchers. As bad weather prevented a major ground attack, the Soviets increased artillery fire and also launched reconnaissance attacks, mostly platoon and company-sized. Rubble from buildings shattered by artillery clogged the streets, and the city's fire department had difficulty extinguishing the flames that seemed to be everywhere. One of the German officers commented that since they were short of ammunition, they could only fire their artillery once for every 20 Soviet shots. The Russians never stopped shelling the small corridor connecting them to Army Group Vistula. In mid-February, the Russians intensified their attacks around Küstrin, hoping to once again cut off the supply corridor to the fortress, but the forces defending the area succeeded in preventing any significant advance. On February 19th, the Germans decided to evacuate some 2,500 civilians from Küstrin. While the evacuations were taking place, the garrison was kept busy repelling Russian attacks on the Küstrin defenses. It should be noted that during these days, Zkukov's attention was focused on repelling Operation Solstice, which the Germans launched against his right flank in Pomerania, and the pressure on Küstrin was relieved. As the Soviets continued their artillery fire in late February, the Hitler Youth boys in Küstrin, who were helping the garrison defenders, were ordered to evacuate the area. Some of them protested, but reluctantly obeyed. Rain lashed the Küstrin sector during the first days of March, making life miserable for both sides. By March 6th, the Soviets launched a major attack on the town. The offensive was directed against Kietz in a surprise attempt to take the suburb. After initial success, the Russians were halted by a desperate counterattack that regained some of the ground lost earlier that day, but left much of the southeastern section of the town in enemy hands. Shortly afterwards, another Soviet attack succeeded in cutting off the corridor, and some 6,000 German defenders were again cut off at Küstrin. The Germans trapped in the fortress were subjected to constant Soviet artillery fire, which gradually reduced them. Finally, by March 12th, the Soviets had succeeded in annihilating most of the German garrison on the east bank of the Oder, after taking almost 3,000 prisoners. While the last German defenders were still at Küstrin, Zkukov was preparing for the assault on Berlin. However, he had to finish taking the city first in order to secure his large bridgehead on the west bank of the Oder. Only the Altstadt sector, which was located on an islet in the middle of the Oder, remained in German hands. The Soviet attacks continued relentlessly over the following days, but they achieved little, and the German corridor was once again left open. On March 22nd, Zkukov launched another major attack with the aim of taking the town of Gorgast, and thereby isolating the Germans in Altstadt again. The idea was to form an inner ring midway between Kietz and Gorgast to trap enemy forces within the picket, and an outer ring east of Gorgast to defend against enemy attacks from the outside. Elements of the Doberitz and Müncheberg divisions were in the planned attack zone. After intense fighting in which the Germans claimed to have destroyed 116 Soviet tanks, the outer pincers of the encirclement were closed that afternoon. Fighting continued on the 23rd as the Russians consolidated their newly gained positions. German counterattacks to reconnect the lines were repulsed with considerable losses on both sides over the following days. In the remnants of the Küstrin garrison, casualties increased as Red artillery continued to attack the Old Town and Oder Island. On March 27th, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack to reopen the corridor. Unlike previous efforts, this was to be a coordinated attack. General Theodor Busse, commander of the Ninth Army, had received orders from Berlin to assemble a force that could break through to the Küstrin garrison. Under the nominal command of General Karl Decker, the attacking force consisted of the 20th and 25th Panzer Grenadier Divisions, the Münchenberg Panzer Division, the Führer Grenadier Division, a tank destroyer battalion with 50 Hetzers, and the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion. At 0400 hours, the German forces moved forward and ran into trouble almost immediately. For the previous 3 days, Russian engineers had been busy laying extensive minefields in front of their positions. In the north, the Müncheberg Division headed towards Genschmar. Under heavy Soviet fire, the spearhead reached the outskirts of the town before being repulsed with heavy losses. The central attacking force, consisting of the Führer Grenadier Division and the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division, broke through the Soviet lines and headed towards the German forces trapped on the west bank of the Oder. They too were forced to retreat after coming under heavy artillery fire and a strong Soviet counterattack. In the south, the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, together with the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, launched their attack. Their objective was Gorgast, but minefields and strong Soviet defensive positions on the main line stopped them short. Again, this grouping of German forces was blocked by mines and Soviet artillery and could do nothing to reach their objective. Still, a few German Tigers managed to knock out at least 4 Soviet tanks before retreating. The failure of the attack had serious consequences. Hitler was furious, and on the evening of March 28th, he vented his anger on the unfortunate Busse, blaming him personally for the failure. While Hitler berated Busse, General Guderian came to his defense. "Allow me to interrupt you," he told Hitler. Barely controlling his anger, he continued, "Yesterday I explained to you in detail, both verbally and in writing, that General Busse is not to blame for the failure of the attack on Küstrin. The Ninth Army used the ammunition that had been allocated to it. The troops did their duty. The unusually high casualty figures prove this. I therefore ask you not to make any accusations against General Busse." After the explosion, Hitler ordered the room to be cleared. Only Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Guderian remained there. Hitler then ordered Guderian to take a 6-week convalescent leave. Guderian would never see Hitler again. On the other hand, Küstrin's fate now seemed decided. When the defenders of Kietz, the island and the old town heard the gunfire drifting away to the west, groups of soldiers decided to take matters into their own hands and prepared to escape. The conclusion reached by the trapped German soldiers was that they had no chance of holding their positions and that an escape attempt was preferable to a Soviet prison camp. Apparently, Oder and Warthe came to the same conclusion. On March 29th, he asked Berlin for permission to escape. His request was denied, but Oder and Warthe had no illusions about what his fate would be if he fell into Soviet hands. He too decided to take the risk and leave Küstrin. In the last hour of March 29th, the breakout began. Having breached the Soviet front line, the garrison forces found themselves in nighttime hand-to-hand combat as they advanced towards the Ninth Army lines. The situation was confusing, and the Germans found themselves under fire not only from the Soviets, but also from their own troops and artillery, who had no idea that a breakthrough was taking place. Aided by surprise, darkness, and intermittent rain, the survivors of Küstrin began trickling towards the Ninth Army line at dawn. Later, Ninth Army headquarters reported that 32 officers and 956 non-commissioned officers and soldiers had managed to break through. Other smaller groups continued to reach the German lines over the next few days. According to a Wehrmacht report, the attempt cost the lives of 627 men and wounded 2,359. Finally, on March 31st, the fortress of Küstrin fell into Russian hands. Zkukov had already taken his springboard to Berlin. The survivors of the breakout were now in a kind of limbo. They were isolated and interrogated, not knowing whether they would be shot or hanged for disobeying an order from the Führer or simply letting go. However, Germany was collapsing, and they were eventually sent to other makeshift units that were being formed to stop the impending offensive that Zkukov would launch again. After the war, the German territory east of the Oder, including the area of Küstrin, was ceded to Poland. Part of the city was rebuilt and is now known as Köstersee. Most of the Altstadt was destroyed and was never rebuilt. The only sound in that area is the eerie whistling of the wind blowing through the skeletal ruins of the shattered houses and buildings, and that is why today it is known as Pompeii on the Oder. So, what do you think? What did you think of the prelude to the Battle of Berlin?